Hello, I'm your host, Brian Callanan. State leaders are preparing for a new legislative session in Olympia, with some new and familiar hurdles ahead.
I know that there are many people in Washington State who are feeling a range of emotions from the presidential election results.
Governor-elect Bob Ferguson says he's ready to protect the evergreen state during a second Trump presidency. But Washington has some homegrown challenges, too.
We are proposing a balanced budget.
Governor Jay Inslee leaves office with a projected $10 to $12 billion deficit over the next 4 years and a controversial plan to help fix it.
I am proposing a new wealth tax.
The proposed 1% annual tax on residents with over $100 million has state Republicans seeing red.
Olympia never seems to have an appetite to cut taxes, only to increase taxes.
But Democrats have larger majorities in the state House and Senate, and party leaders say a push for new revenue is definitely on the docket.
Whether it's a wealth tax or a payroll tax, I do think there's capacity.
We need to really think carefully about how to do that in a way where it will actually collect the money.
And what other priorities are on the horizon? Our panel of lawmakers weighs in.
We need to make sure our permitting and environmental review laws are up to date.
A look ahead at the 2025 state legislative session, next on City Inside Out. Welcome once again to City Inside Out. I'm Brian Callanan. Great to be with you. And I have with me 3 members of our Seattle delegation from Olympia. That would be Senator Jamie Pedersen, the Democrat from the 43rd District, downtown Seattle, up to UW. He's also Senate Majority Leader. Great to have you, Senator Pedersen.
Thank you.
Joining us also, we have Senator Rebecca Saldaña, the Democrat from the 37th District down in Southeast Seattle. She's also chair of the Labor and Commerce Committee. Great to have you, too.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning to you. And also from the House, we have Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, the Democrat from the 34th District from West Seattle out to Vashon Island. He's also the House Majority Leader. Great to see you again, Representative Fitzgibbon.
Thanks.
Let's dive into this. And Senator Pedersen, I want to start with you on the state budget deficit that we've been hearing about, $10 to $12 billion anticipated over the next 4 years, this coming from the Office of Financial Management. But then I saw this study a couple months ago from Wallet Hub that showed our state's economy is the strongest in the country, #1 when it comes to economic health and innovation. So why are we talking about a budget deficit?
Well, to be clear, it's not because our revenues have crashed. So this is a very different situation from what we experienced in the Great Recession. What happened, I think, is really 2 things. Number one, there were some unusual spending patterns during the pandemic. People bought a lot more goods and bought fewer services.
Okay.
And because Washington's tax system is uniquely bad and very dependent on sales taxes, we tax goods and not services. For a period of time, our tax revenues just went through the roof. That has flattened out over time, but wasn't accounted for in the projections, which sort of thought that they would keep on going up at the same rate. At the same time, we decided to make some significant investments, for example, in childcare, making it less expensive and more affordable for families, and providing better wages for people who were employed in childcare. And we programmed those increases to come in over time. What you're now seeing in the 4-year outlook is the effect both of the flattening of revenues and the increased commitments for services. And so in all likelihood, we're going to have to look both at the possibility of additional revenue and at slowing down or reducing some of the planned increases that we had in programs.
Thank you for that overview. Senator Saldaña, maybe I can get a chair of Labor and Commerce perspective from you. What are your thoughts about the deficit?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is, again, unlike the last recession, when we faced the pandemic, we said that we are going to prioritize equity and prioritize making sure that people are putting people first. And so we did strengthen protections for workers. We did make sure that we smooth things out for employers so they wouldn't see spikes in unemployment insurance rates, and all of that meant that we are doing the right thing, in my opinion, of making sure that we're keeping people healthy and safe, and being a partner to business to make sure that we can smooth where we can the impacts of the COVID pandemic and economic challenges that we're seeing with inflation now. And so that means, we made good decisions, but this year we're going to have to look at, how do we make sure that we continue to be a good partner in supporting a strong economy.
Thank you. And before we get into the revenue discussion, which I really do want to get into, maybe I can talk about Governor Inslee's budget proposal, because it's talking about some cuts. And Representative Fitzgibbon, I'll start with you. Maybe the idea of postponing putting more money into programs like the Fair Start for Kids Act, which is all about early child care and education, could save more than $2 billion over the next 4 years by itself. Is that the right place to cut? Talk to me about some of the different reductions that the governor is talking about and your reaction to them, please.
Yeah, well, there's no reductions that the governor has proposed, or really, substantial reductions that we could ever consider that wouldn't have impacts on Washingtonians. And we have to be clear-eyed about that, and we have to be upfront about that. Certainly, childcare accessibility and affordability is a really high priority for Washingtonians, and it's not something that we take lightly to look at potentially delaying some of those expansions. That said, I think in general, we feel that it's less harmful to delay a planned increase in benefits than to cut benefits that are currently being provided today. So expanding the number of Washingtonians who qualify for subsidized childcare is scheduled in both 2025 and 2027. It's probably less harmful for us to delay those expansions than it is for us to cut the number of Washingtonians qualifying for some other service like healthcare, childcare, higher education. Okay.
Any other thoughts about these cuts here before we move on to revenue? Senator Saldaña, some thoughts?
Well, I, of course, representing Southeast Seattle, and was with many of the folks that voted no on those initiatives to say that we don't want to go backwards. And I do think it really is looking at equity. I do think that there's ways for us to look at new revenues and look at how are we adjusting, basically looking at new revenues and looking at where are there places that we can actually make government smarter, and necessarily like delaying access to childcare is not necessarily one of those things. We've heard from business and workers and families that really childcare is the backbone to making sure the rest of our economy works.
Okay. Some thoughts before we move into the revenue piece, which I know we're going to get to, but some final thoughts about these cuts before we do, Senator Pedersen.
Well, I think the thing that we haven't talked about is that it's the outgoing governor who proposed those cuts, and we have a brand new governor who's about to start, who probably will have a lot of different ideas, both things that he wants to fund that are new and other ideas about potential cuts. And so I think we're going to have an interesting session ahead of us working through those conversations with him.
Okay, that's a very good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. So let's jump into revenue here. Maybe Representative Fitzgibbon, I'll start with you. And just to add some perspective here, I know you've heard it before from the minority leader of the House, Republican Drew Stokesbury, wants to slow down the growth of government, not add new taxes. I just bring that up for some perspective here. Does Washington State need new taxes? And if so, who should be paying them?
Yeah, I think that we'll be looking at an approach that is balanced, that looks at, are there places that we can be more efficient with state government? Are there cuts that we can make that aren't really, going to critically impact the lives of Washingtonians, as well as looking at revenue options, particularly revenue options that ask the wealthiest people in our society who currently pay very little in taxes to pay a little bit more of their fair share. We know that Washington has now the second most regressive tax structure of any state, up from first most, so that's an improvement. But we still have a tax structure that relies pretty heavily on the spending of the poorest Washingtonians. And I think that we'd like to see whatever revenue strategies we pursue this year. And I do think that we need to pursue revenue strategies if we want to support public education and higher education and childcare and healthcare in our state. That our goal would be to both protect Washington's competitive economy as well as to ask the wealthiest people in our state to to support the investments that we need to make our state continue to have a strong economy.
I know Governor Inslee has talked about a wealth tax. We can touch on that in a little bit. And Senator Saldaña, maybe I can phrase it this way. I've just heard from a number of different people, a number of Democrats, that the November vote to reject a ban on capital gains taxes, 2109, is an indicator that our state is maybe primed to consider taxes on wealthy people or corporations. Is that the way you see the situation, or what's your position on looking for new tax revenue in the 2025 season here?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that Washington State we're so lucky to live in Washington State. We have so many strong resources, and many businesses and individuals have been able to be highly successful with global companies doing well. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think that those that have done really well need to pay what they owe, and they owe a huge debt to Washington for what we've been able to contribute with our infrastructure, with the resources, and with this beautiful place that we get to call home. And so I think capital gains is something that showed a lot of strength and support for, and I do think that whether it's a wealth tax or a payroll tax, I do think there's capacity in Washington State for us to be able to make sure we can address housing, childcare, and education. Right.
Senator Pedersen, is there an option that looks good to you? I know the governor's talked about this 1% wealth tax on assets over $100 million. There's even some talk about a payroll expense tax model, a lot like the Seattle Jumpstart model going statewide. What makes sense to you?
I think one of the things that the three of us have in common is we can probably vote for just about anything for our constituents. And the question is really sorting through what are the options that have the fewest downsides, right? We have, with the wealth tax, I think the potential to make the tax system a lot fairer. But on the other hand, the narrower the base of people that you're talking about, the more likely it is that there could be avoidance behavior, right?
I see.
People moving out of state or structuring their lives so that they don't owe the tax.
Right, because this wealth tax, last year there was that $250 million threshold. I think the government...
$1 billion.
Excuse me, yes, right, okay.
Yeah.
Right, and
so
now,
then you're literally talking about 15 or 20 people.
I see.
And the way that the tax was structured at that point, you had to be present in the state for more than 183 days a year in order for it to apply.
Okay.
Well, it's not that hard. If you have wealth on that scale, you probably have homes all over the world, all over the country, and you probably naturally travel several months a year. It's not that hard to imagine that if it could save you $1 billion in taxes, that you might stretch out your time in Hawaii or Switzerland or something. So we need to think really carefully about, because that's not a tax that anyone else has tried to impose. We need to really think carefully about how to do that in a way where it will actually collect the money. Because the point is not to make a political point off of villainizing people because of their wealth and success. It's to raise money to support programs that we need for whether it's kids with disabilities who are going to public school or families who need access to childcare or health care. Those are the kinds of programs that we want to make sure are robustly funded.
Okay. Thank you. And I wanted to follow up with you, Senator Saldaña, on maybe a little bit more about what you heard from voters this past November. I mentioned the capital gains tax vote on 2109, but there was also a no vote on 2117, which will, in effect, preserve the Climate Commitment Act and its cap and trade system. Then you have I-2124, another measure that was rejected. It'll keep in place our state's long-term care insurance program. I just wanted to ask you in general here what message that you drew from those votes and how that shapes your approach to the session ahead.
Well, I mean, I think what I heard is that people recognize that the infrastructure that we've built in Washington State will not stay as great as it is without investment. People want to see a clean-fueled future. They want to see roads that are smooth and allow people, whether they're walking or rolling or driving, to be able to get where they need to go safely. They want, and they so many of us, are experiencing what it is not to have adequate care, whether you're caring for your parents, whether you're caring for your children, whether you're caring for someone with a disability. And we all know that the economy in the private market is not providing that for us, that we need a strong government to partner with private enterprise and with our residents to be able to make these things happen that one individual family can't do by themselves.
Okay. Representative Fitzgibbon, I just thought it was really interesting, looking even bigger picture here, just how the Republican Party used the initiative process last year. 3 out of 4 initiatives that went to a public vote were defeated. We talked about a few of those there. But during the session, 3 measures the GOP put together were passed by the state legislature. On police pursuits, ban on a state income tax, this measure calling for parental notification about student health and discipline records. I just wanted to ask, do you anticipate seeing this tactic again with the GOP using the initiative process in this way?
Well, I'm not going to make any predictions about what we might see from the Republicans. I think the initiative process has been used by folks on all sides of the political spectrum to advance goals that were not getting through the legislature. Yeah. That's been true in Washington for nearly 100 years. Yeah. I'm sure we will see more initiatives in the future. I think that I'm really proud of how Washingtonians, and Democrats in the legislature made the case to keep a capital gains tax, to keep long-term care insurance program, and to keep the Climate Commitment Act. Mm-hmm. I think what we really saw is that when Washingtonians heard about and understood the benefits of those programs, they chose to keep them. Okay. And I think that will still be true in the future. Okay,
Senator Pedersen, I could use your legal mind ahead with what's happening with I-2066. Voters said yes to this measure, prohibits the state from passing laws to discourage the use of natural gas. I know some lawsuits have been filed on this from some environmental groups. The city of Seattle, King County also involved that. Do you expect to see any action from the legislature when it comes to 2066 this year?
I do not. I feel pretty confident that when the courts are finished considering that, they'll conclude that it was unconstitutional because it included more than one subject. And so I think we'll be back to the law that we passed, and I suspect that we'll then want to make some tweaks to that.
Okay, I'm interested to see how that pans out. Senator Saldaña, I wanted to talk about maybe some of the specific measures you're working on for this session. There are more than 300 pre-filed bills for the legislature here as of early January, and I know you're working on a few different things. Do you have a top priority in 2025 that you'd like to let us know about, maybe something that hasn't been discussed here so far?
Yeah, I think in general, in the Labor and Commerce Committee in the Senate this year, it's about making sure that the protections that we have for workers encompass all workers. And so I do have a bill that builds on the good work of the people of Seattle for domestic workers and be able to include them. But I think the other piece, too, is looking at the impact of small businesses. And so I do have a bill that would preclude big credit card companies from charging a service fee on tipped wages and tax collection that small businesses and businesses across the state do to be able to make sure that their workers have those tips and make sure that they stay in the pockets of both the workers and more money in the small businesses.
And there's one other piece about oversight for the city, county, regional jail system. Yeah. Would you touch on that? I know this is something you worked on for a little while.
Yeah, so this was when we serve in the legislature, we often get assigned to task force, and I got assigned on behalf of the Senate Democrats to serve on the task force for jail oversight. And through that process, I was alarmed to see the conditions of our jails and that there was really across the state, 50 different jails, all with different standards, all with different practices, and unfortunately, we're the fourth highest in the nation for deaths in our jails. And so out of that good work, there was a set of recommendations, and one of them is to reestablish an oversight committee for jail standards. And we had this when I was born in 1977, but got disbanded in '84. I think we did some good modernization, and they're like, well, now everyone can just do their thing. Yeah. But it turns out that when everyone does their thing without, coordination and best practice in place. It's a mixed match, and I think we in Washington State can join over half of the other states in our country and make sure that we have that.
Okay. Senator Pedersen, something you might be looking at here. I'm on page 55 out of 80 on that measure you're working on with common interest communities, places like condos with HOAs. And I know we talked about this earlier. Is that a top priority for you? You've been working on that for a long time.
That has been a project for a long time. So, about a third of people in our state live in some kind of common interest community,
right.
A homeowner association or a condo association or a co-op. And this is a bill, probably the fourth or fifth in a series of bills that I've worked on over time that try to improve the governance of those associations to strike a good balance between making sure that the rights of homeowners are protected and that the communities are actually functional, that their little governments that they have can work appropriately and have democracy flourish on that scale.
Okay. Interested to see what happens there. Representative Fitzgibbon, a personal goal for you this session or some legislation you'd like to see go forward?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we will definitely be looking at our climate and energy policies. I think now with Initiative 2117 behind us, looking at what are some opportunities for us to make sure all these laws are working well together. I think we'll be looking at the Clean Buildings Law and the Clean Electricity Law, both of which passed in 2019, to make sure that now that they're 4 years in or 6 years in, that that they're working well. I think there are some opportunities to strengthen those and to also to ease compliance. I think we'll be looking at the Clean Fuel Standard, which passed in 2021, and looking at, are there some ways that we can tighten up some loose aspects of that law. And then I think our really big project on energy and climate in the years to come is to make sure that we can actually site and build the energy facilities of the future. The dirty energy facilities that were built before we had strong energy laws, strong environmental protections, have the power of incumbency in order to get the new energy, the new transportation fuel, the new clean electricity online that we need to protect our climate. We need to make sure our permitting and environmental review laws are up to date. And so that's something we've been working on for a number of years, and I expect we'll continue to work on this year.
All right. Thank you for that overview. It is time to wrap up. Senator Pedersen, I think I've counted around 30-plus seats in the House and Senate with new people in those roles, varying levels of experience there. You got some longtime reps and senators stepping down. Then there are others like Senator Cooterer leaving to become insurance commissioner. Senator Wen, new leader of the Department of Commerce, so you're going to need some replacements there. I just wanted to ask, what are your expectations? You have a long session ahead, busy budget year, a lot of turnover. You're the Senate Majority Leader. How are you going to steer the ship?
Well, I do think that given the number of new folks that we have 9 new members out of 30 in our caucus, that there's going to be a need for a lot of conversation, a lot of team building to make sure that we know where we want to go together. We have been having those conversations all through the interim in our caucus, and I think have a lot of alignment around the idea that we need to focus on funding for public schools, on housing and behavioral health, public safety, as the sort of big focuses for this session. All of that, of course, happens in the context of a really challenging budget situation. So there will be no end of fun in the next 4 months.
I'm sure of that. And Senator Saldaña, this is something I wish I could have touched on earlier, but we also have a new presidential administration promising mass deportations and a lot of uncertainty for our state here. I've heard the governor-elect gearing up for this. I just wanted to ask, how will a second Trump term impact our state when it comes to immigration? What are you getting ready for? I know this is an issue that's near and dear to you.
Yeah, I mean, I joined the legislature at the end of 2016, and over that time period, what's different this time is that we've put a lot of strength in. We have Keeping Washington Working. We have added immigration status to our law of protection against discrimination, and we have invested in making sure that we have people having access to health care in Washington State. So I think we're in a strong place. It's about defending and making sure that people know that here in this state, we will continue to stand up for all Washingtonians.
Thank you very much for that. Representative Fitzgibbon, I'll let you wrap up. Over the past couple of years, I've heard different sessions called the Year of Housing or other such names. Do you have a name for this session in 2025, or what are you looking forward to?
Well, I think sometimes those names are easier to identify in hindsight than they are headed into the session.
Yeah.
I will feel really great about this session if we can get out with a budget that that protects the things that Washingtons care about the most: K-12 education, higher education, behavioral health care, public safety, child care. Those are the biggest things that state government does. They're also the most expensive things that state government does, and it's become more expensive for state government to provide services, just like it's become more expensive for households and businesses to pay for their expenses. So that's just the unfortunate reality of the economy that we're in right now. But I think that if we can get out of town with feeling really good about education and behavioral health, then I would call it a great year.
All right, thank you all for this, and we will be right back. What are people saying online about the state legislators' revenue proposals in the new session? One person writes, "It seems to me and my ever-expanding tax bill that we keep getting the same answer to every policy question. There's a tax for that." Another person comments, "The wealthy should pay more, period. They are in a better position to do so. It's a step in the right direction." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on social media. Great to get those comments, and thank you all for your input as well. We will see you next time on City Inside Out.